I've met before. I'm Congressman Bill Johnson. I want to thank you for coming today to participate in today's important briefing on religious religion and violence in Sri Lanka. I'm also proud to co-chair, along with my colleague, Representative Danny Davis, the Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka. For those of you who haven't attended one of our caucus events before, welcome. And for the rest of you, it's nice to see some familiar faces. As many of you know, rights and identity of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka who are being excluded from society, from the economy, and from political life through discrimination, harassment, and persecution. Since we started the caucus back in 2013, some progress has been made to increase democratic principles and restore human rights for all Sri Lankans, notably due to the election of the Jerryson government in 2015. However, there is considerable work that must be done before those rights are fully restored. Work with the Jerryson government has committed to accomplish by co-sponsoring Resolution 30-1 at the UN Human Rights Council. However, at the UN Human Rights Council meetings last month, High Commissioner Zed said the following: "In Sri Lanka, I am very alarmed by recurring and continuing episodes of mob violence targeting ethnic and religious minorities, particularly Muslims, including most recently in Ampara and in several locations in the Kandy district, leading to the declaration of a nationwide state of emergency for 10 days. There should be no impunity, either for the incitement that led to the attacks or the attacks themselves. I have repeatedly urged the government to advance its implementation of the transitional justice agenda. I regret the absence of meaningful progress. It is urgent for the sake of the victims that progress be made on accountability and transitional justice. In the absence of such progress, I would encourage member states to explore the use of universal jurisdiction." And again, that was a quote by UN Human Rights Council High Commissioner Zaid last month. Accordingly, the subject of today's briefing is religion and violence in Sri Lanka. As the High Commissioner noted, there continues to be violence against religious and ethnic minorities in Sri Lanka. This kind of violence is unacceptable. Not only does it emphasize the need for implementing transitional justice reforms, but these violent episodes detract from any progress made towards that end. I'm looking forward to hearing what our distinguished speakers have to say and any recommendations on how Sri Lanka can move forward and become a peaceful, inclusive society for all of its citizens. Representative Davis is not here. He got called into a meeting, so I'm going to turn it over now to Laura from my staff, you're going to say a few words on Representative Davis's behalf. Right. Welcome to the microphone, and I will be back just as soon as I can. That's my commitment to you. I'll see you shortly. Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you. Congressman Danny K. Davis, wish he could attend this meeting right now. He's having a meeting with our minority leader, Nancy Pelosi. So I'm going to make a statement on his behalf. These are the words that he would like to share at this particular briefing. President Sarasena and the Sri Lanka government back in 2015 promised to create 4 transitional justice mechanisms to address abuses related to 2.5-decade conflict and civil war that ended in 2009. They are as follows: Office of Missing Persons, Office of Reparations, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Accountability Mechanism. However, according to the Human Rights Watch article dated November the 15th, 2017, the Sri Lankan government has only established the Office of Missing Persons. This government's budget outline for fiscal year 2018 contains no reference or allocation for the remaining 3 mechanisms. Other resolution undertakings such as security sector reform and land reform remain largely unfilled. Some analysts have reported that the Sri Lankan government has done very little to promote justice and peace among its ethnic and religious population. History has demonstrated that when we do not learn from our past, we are doomed to repeat it. Today we will hear from our distinguished scholars and advocates about religion and violence in Sri Lanka, and how the Sri Lankan government and the United States government efforts can identify ways to improve the peace process in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our panel to you. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Jerryson, who is an associate professor for religious studies at Youngstown State University. He received his PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Jerryson's work focuses on intersections between identity and violence and the ways in which we associate religious identities with peace and violence. He also has a new publication out this year. If you meet the Buddha on the road, Buddhism, politics, and violence. Next, we'll hear from Arulthas. Mario is Advocacy Director for PEARL, which is People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, which is a nonprofit led by human rights activists with a mission of ending systemic human rights abuses against the Tamil population in Sri Lanka and promoting equality, rights, and justice on the island. Mario received his Bachelor of Arts in Business Management from the University of Westminster, and he has also served as the editor-in-chief of the London-based Tamil Guardian. Mario made his most recent trip to Sri Lanka earlier this year and has some important insight from his visit, which we'll be sharing today. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Oberst. We were fortunate to hear from Dr. Oberst today. He is a professor of political science at Nebraska Wesleyan University, received his PhD in political science from Syracuse University, and is one of the leading experts in the United States on Sri Lankan politics. Thank you all for making the trip to this.
I would like to thank Representative Johnson, Representative Davis for maintaining public visibility over the religious and ethnic violence in Sri Lanka. As a professor of religious studies, my goal is not to advocate for religion. People usually are confused with what I'm supposed to be doing with my job, but to understand religion in the public sphere, its economic, social, psychological, and political influences. And I've been studying Buddhism and violence for over 15 years. When you see religion and violence coming together, it has been an incredible way of motivating, changing the way people begin to justify their actions. People might be willing to go to war to a certain extent when it comes to money, but when you make it about good versus evil, right versus wrong, they're much more willing to sacrifice themselves and all they believe in to make things happen. I've worked in conflict zones, whether in deep south or southern Thailand. I've interviewed and researched for Buddhist violence against Rohingya, and for over a decade followed the Sri Lankan Buddhist roles in violence. I interviewed with prominent Buddhist organizational leaders such as Janasa Tero, the Buddha Sena, right after the 2014 Buddhist rise in Arulthas. And whenever I talk about Buddhism and violence, people think it's an oxymoron. They think, well, how can Buddhists be violent? Let me say there's been we have over 1,500 years of evidence of Buddhist monks involved in revolts, messianic warfare, conflicts, tortures, justifying Buddhist principles. If you're interested in looking at this, you can look to my edited volume, Buddhist Warfare. You can also look to my previous publications, Buddhist Fury in southern Thailand. As was mentioned, I just published a book on the relationship between Buddhism and violence this month through Oxford, looking at everything from gender discrimination to issues of blasphemy. And what I found, and some of my colleagues have found, that journalists and policymakers often overlook or misunderstand the role of Buddhism in countries like Sri Lanka or Myanmar or Thailand. Because Buddhist monks have an authority that goes beyond what we think of as religion. It gets into a social and a political dimension. And it's important for us to be cognizant of how the U.S. is viewed by these politicized Buddhist organizations and individuals. For example, we can say all we want about how the Buddhist monks in Myanmar are saying the wrong things. They're not true Buddhists. But this is not going to affect the way that Burmese, for example, view and acknowledge the authority of these Buddhist monks and what they say. which is seen as on the same level as, let's say, citing the Christian Bible. So Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka all hold very powerful influences that go beyond simply the temple format. Now, the Buddhist influence in the Sri Lankan politics has been gradually increasing over 100 years. And one thing we can look to, for example, is when the British colonized Sri Lanka, they created a vacuum of political connections. By that I mean that, historically speaking, Sri Lanka had a Sangha, a monastic community, that would always rely upon the state for protection. And when the British came in, they were looking to the British to renew this commitment of protecting the Sangha, the Buddhist community. And the British said, no, separation of church and state, we don't get into all of this. And this created a historical vacuum that never existed in the Sri Lankan kingdoms. And what we began to see from that point onward was Buddhist monks began to take a role in politics because they no longer saw the state being involved in protecting their interests. We saw violence taking place as early as the 1900s against Muslims and Tamils. This became alarmingly visible during the 26-year civil war from 1983 to 2009 with the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam. And during this time period, we saw the Janati Vimukta Paramuna, the JVP, become very robust in their efforts, including Buddhist monks in the organization who have been accused of assassination attempts and inciting violence against Tamils. The JVP has now become an official party, a part of the Sri Lankan government, but it was during this time period we saw more political roles, public roles taking place for Buddhist monks. And during this time period they invoked sacred scriptures like the Mahavamsa, which is considered to be the Sinhalese Buddhist heritage, sections that would that often were used to demonize Tamils. In 2004, the JHU, the Jatika Hela Urumaya, won 9 seats in parliament, and some of these were from Sri Lankan Buddhist monks, which is unheard of in Theravada Buddhist countries to actually hold a political position. But this, again, is showing this increasing role of becoming more political in Sri Lanka. Now, demographics in Sri Lanka, for those who are not aware, the majority of Sri Lankans identify as Buddhist, over 70%, with over 12% identifying as Hindu, 9% identifying with Islam, and over 7% identifying with Christianity, whether Catholicism or Orthodox or Protestant forms. And while Sri Lanka isn't multi-ethnic and multi-religious, with laws that may prohibit in some levels hate crimes, it has sustained a Buddhist bias within its legal and political infrastructure. For instance, its constitution states, quote, "The Republic of Sri Lanka shall give to Buddhism the foremost place, and accordingly it shall be the duty of the state to foster and protect the Buddhist sasana, the Buddhist religion, while assuring to all religions the rights granted by Articles 10 and 14. So we see here the subordination of other religions to that of Buddhism. And legal protections against hate crimes have been insufficient. There's been persistent hate crimes, persecutions, and discriminations for decades, particular patterns of spiking of violence around election periods, which we just saw most recently as well, too. Now, in 2009, at the end of the 26-year civil war against the LTTE, we saw a shift in which, instead of targeting Tamils, we began to see Muslims being depicted as the primary threat, and a growth of Islamophobia. So when I met with Janara Saratero, for example, who has been the leader of the Bada Bala Singh, he explained that Muslims are seeking to take over Sri Lanka. That there's a sort of Islamification taking place. They're relying upon the Saudis for money to do so, and was very dismissive of any sort of facts or evidence that might prove otherwise to his accusations. He saw also the threats of Christianity at this time too. And I think John Sartero represents significant factions within the Buddhist organizations in which they see, whether right or wrong, this Islamic threat that was threatening the survival for them of Buddhism in the country. Even though you have 7% of them being Buddhist, they are fearful, and so they say they're fearful of Buddhism's survival. Because for these Buddhists, they think that the Buddhism of Sri Lanka is the true Buddhism in the world. The teardrop island that's existed for so long, since the 4th century BCE, and must be preserved and maintained at all costs. And that's the perspective they give. So, due to tensions and micro-skirmishes, one incident can trigger larger communal violence. And often Buddhist organizations are behind the feeling of anger against religious minorities. Since 2012, Buddhist organizations have incited violence against religious leaders, religious spaces, Christian pastors, Muslims, imams, Hindu priests. And since Jerryson's administration took over in 2015, there has been familiar triggers that have led to Buddhist riots. For example, over female bodies, what they're wearing, how they should look. Buddhist organizations labeled the hijab or the face covering as galibila, as a symbolizing monster, and used that as a rhetorical way of attacking Muslim dress. There was a push for halal bans, riots in 2013, 2014, and beyond. We saw in the imposed state of emergency just last month issues having to do with this. In Ampara, there was an issue over a Muslim-owned restaurant for purportedly pushing sterilization pills. So it's fears that Muslims are using their food industry as a way to take over, to reduce, or to attack the Sinhalese Buddhists. And so these fears, although we've been proven to be completely unsubstantiated, begin to motivate or push people to commit violence. There's also been individual clashes sometimes between, let's say, a person identifying as Muslim and Buddhist that can lead to larger, greater violence. In the Kandy district, Muslims attacked a Buddhist driver in February, which led to massive surges of attacks against Muslim places of worship. Muslims were killed with over 400 Muslim homes destroyed. But to just close this too, to give more time for my colleagues, I want to point out that anger is never a primary emotion. It's a secondary emotion. Fear is always underneath the anger. And here we're seeing these Buddhist organizations, the fear of what they think of is the rising population of Muslims, the fear of interfaith marriage. And we can see also the concern about the international domino effect taking place, in which violence taking place in Bangladesh or Myanmar sometimes triggers into what happens in Sri Lanka, and likewise in that fashion. Rohingya refugees in September were forced to flee a UN-sanctioned house because of Buddhist monks attacking them. So it's not just what happens in Sri Lanka will only be in Sri Lanka, but this has reverberations beyond Sri Lanka as well. For example, also, Sitaku Siada, a very prominent Burmese Buddhist monk, just gave a sermon last fall to Burmese soldiers invoking the Mahavamsa in the wake of massive violence against Rohingya. So we see that what's happening in Sri Lanka has big impacts on other Buddhist societies as well.
Thank you, Michael. I'll speak a bit more about what Michael has elaborated, and I'll provide a bit of context to how this has affected the Tamil people in the northeast of the island and across the island, and also what effects this has on other minorities over the years. As Michael mentioned, in the 20th century, the first act of ethno-religious violence was actually committed by the Sinhalese people against Muslims. Over 100 were killed after prolonged and widespread anti-Muslim pogroms across the country. And these acts of singular Buddhist violence against Tamil-speaking Hindus, Christians, and Muslims have not been isolated incidents. These have been frequent occurrences throughout Sri Lanka's history post-independence also. And I'm going to look a bit about why this happens, why this has continued to happen. It seems to be a cycle that the latest iteration we saw earlier this year. Although at independence, Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was known at the time, it inherited well-governed state structures and a Westminster-style parliamentary governance arrangement from the British. Independence saw successive governments embarking on a nation-building program that was based on an exclusively singular Buddhist nationalist ideology. This nationalism was to become indistinguishable from a new virulent form of singular Buddhist chauvinism. Sankaran Krishnan, in his seminal study on Sri Lanka, he pointed out that since the first election, quote, the two main parties, the UNP and the SLFP, were locked in a battle for the allegiance of the majority, and the appeal to ethnic chauvinism became a staple of everyday politics. Neil Devota, another leading scholar on Sri Lanka, notes that both parties comprised mainly of singular Buddhists, catered mainly to singular Buddhist interests. So what did this mean in practice? So under the governments led by both parties, this translated into a series of patently ethnically discriminatory policies. For example, Tamils were marginalized from public service, the military, and things like university access. Also, the electoral map was altered to ensure permanent singular dominance of government in certain regions. and particularly in the key strategic regions of the northeast. And these then in turn precipitated an intense and very violent ethnic crisis, of course, including the 3 decades of brutal war between 83 and 2009, the root causes of which are yet to be resolved. So while singular Buddhist majoritarianism has most prominently clashed with the resistance by the Tamil community, particularly since the end of the war in 2009, it has also manifested itself in relation to Christians and Muslims through attacks on churches, mosques, and places frequented by communities belonging to these minority religions. And the wider point here is that the radical singular Buddhist, the chauvinist ideology is located in the mainstream. It's not a fringe movement. It's not something that's on the fringe of society. They are the mainstream social hierarchies and the sentiments in Sri Lanka. And in practice, this means that in order to be Sri Lankan, one either has to be a singular Buddhist or, as a minority, accept singular Buddhist hegemony in Sri Lanka. And the refusal of most Tamils since independence to accept singular Buddhist hegemony is what led to the armed conflict. It's what led to the initial peaceful resistance and then the armed movements. And after the defeat of the Tamil armed resistance, we now see other groups, including Christians and Muslims, being targeted. So, since independence, despite the deepening ethnic strife marked by increasing mass protests by Tamils and then in response the periodic anti-Tamil riots, the process of singular Buddhist transformation of the state reached a watershed in 1972, as Michael mentioned, when the singular-dominated parliament discarded the British-supplied constitution and replaced it with a new constitution. This was also when the country's name was changed from Ceylon to Sri Lanka, to the singular name Sri Lanka. And the most significant aspect of the new constitution was to elevate Buddhism to primacy in state identity and policy. And I know you read this, but I think it's important to repeat. The constitution says, the Republic of Sri Lanka shall give to Buddhism the foremost place, and accordingly it shall be the duty of the state to protect and foster the Buddhasasana. And as you can see, singular Buddhist ideology and the propagation of it is deeply embedded in the state and its institutions. So what does singular Buddhist nationalism mean? What does this ideology actually stand for? The singular Buddhist nationalism, as in the Chronicles of the Mahavamsa is detailed, it holds the entire island to be the motherland of the Sinhalese, and this is believed to have been decreed as such by the Buddha himself, and for the express purpose, and this is important, for the express purpose of safeguarding Buddhism. So it's seen as the last bastion of a Buddhist country in a region where Buddhists are in a minority. Consequently, to protect the Buddhasasana, as it says in the constitution, it means to defend the unitary nature of the state and the singular Buddhist character of the island from both internal and external enemies. And this translates not only into rejection and violence in response to Tamil demands for autonomy or self-determination, but also rejection of various international demands and pressure put on Sri Lanka, for example, about power sharing, peace deals with Tamils under a new constitution, and accountability for the military's wartime atrocities, both of which are key demands of the US government to this day. So this means anything and anyone perceived as a threat to singular Buddhist, to the singular Buddhist nature of the country, may it be Tamils, may it be Muslims, NGOs, the US or the Human Rights Council, and even Sinhalese who reject the Buddhist nationalist chauvinist principles, they will be attacked, undermined, and perceived as enemies of the state. And just to give you an example of one of the institutions that is heavily affected by this, it's the military. It's a state institution emblematic of the unification of state and religion. So despite the war being over for 9 years, the military today, last year when the figures that we got were 243,000 large, which is, for a country of 20 million, it's larger than the military of the UK, it's larger than the military of France or of Israel. And it's overwhelmingly deployed in the Tamil areas. Out of 7 regional commands, 5 are in the Tamil Northeast, which makes up about 25% of the country. Second, so first of all, the military is overwhelmingly similar. Second, the military's routine practices are steeped in singular Buddhist ideology. Its leading regiments are named after famous centuries-old singular warrior king with Buddhist ceremonies. And the relevance of all this is to underline first the unity in security force practices between defending the nation and the state on the one hand and Buddhism itself on the other, and second, the political and social legitimacy this unity accords to singular Buddhist nationalist organizations, both with the state and the singular public on affairs of state security. So how does this relate to the situation today? While the Tamils were being fought for decades, the Muslim community has actually been able to grow economically and demographically in certain areas, and in response giving rise to toxic rhetoric against the community. The recent riots specifically targeted against the Muslim community must be seen in that context. The perceived disproportionate economic success by the Muslim community and the perceived surge in population against it threatened the idea of a singular Buddhist island. And of course the government has defended its response, but what we must remember is it took 5 days for the government to wrest back control from those mobs, which were often led by Buddhist monks. Not only that, the police and the special task force, which is a paramilitary police force, were recorded to have taken part in this violence against Muslims. One video that emerged, you can see members of the STF, of the special task force, assaulting Muslims near a mosque. And although arrests were made, not a single Buddhist monk who were often leading the violence and taking part in the violence has been detained. And that demonstrates the power that the Buddhist clergy has over the state. And a few days after the violence, one of the leading firebrand monks who you spoke about, Jnanasara Thero, the head of the BBS, the Bodhabala Sena, he actually met with the president of Sri Lanka. So you have to think about what sort of message this sends. I mean, he was able to get a meeting with the president days after he instigated this sort of violence. Well, not only that, I just saw it in the news today that yesterday he met with the agricultural minister. So I mean, this is clearly something where these extremist Buddhist organizations have high-level access to the state. What has continued over the last few years is churches and mosques have been attacked. Christians have been discriminated against in various spaces across the island. Hindu temples have been attacked, but also encroached on by Buddhists. And this is also, again, another department where Buddhism and the state interact quite closely, is the archaeological department, where field researchers would come and discover a rock and say this is a 2,000-year-old Buddhist temple on the premise of a Hindu temple or a church, and then declare it as a holy Buddhist site, and then they will be moved out. And these sort of incidents have happened repeatedly over the last 3 years, especially. All this is very well documented, and I think there's some very good organizations on the ground that bring this information out under enormous risk. About the change, local journalists, for example, who cover these issues, have continued to face harassment and surveillance, particularly in the northeast. And in the south, it's not bad. I think it's journalists can act with relative freedom. However, in the northeast, and especially for Tamil journalists, the sort of surveillance and harassment by the military and intelligence services continue. I myself, when I was there last year, was followed and videoed and harassed by the military while I was covering some issues that were happening at the time, a protest that was happening at the time. In a clear act of intimidation, I mean, they would just come and take their phones out and stand next to me in their uniform and try to record me. So this is the sort of thing that still happens on a everyday basis. And this brings it back to to singular Buddhist nationalism, right? The accountability for the war crimes. I didn't speak much about that, but as you know, the war ended really horrifically in 2009, and this current government in 2015 had committed to providing mechanisms to provide justice and accountability. However, I think most people now would agree that progress has been scant and doubt the government's genuineness about providing these sort of measures. I mean, the president, the prime minister, senior ministers all have reverted onto their promises and said, oh, actually, maybe we need other mechanisms first and we're not going to look at accountability now, or we won't need a justice mechanism because our military, we won't sell out our war heroes. That's basically the narrative that they've created. So the narrative that the state has created now is that they have saved the Sri Lanka from the threat of Geneva, from the threat of the Human Rights Council, from the threat that an internationally mandated, as they say, accountability mechanism would have brought to the island. And so unless there's an overall overhaul of the state in order to fix the deep-rooted chauvinism in these structures, these efforts at peace building and reconciliation that we see now are bound to fail. As we can see, the violence is literally, a finger snap away. It could kick off like that. A piecemeal solution to these issues will continue to exacerbate tensions that we've seen, and it will increase the risk of a return to instability and violence. And the return of violence last month against Muslims, this was predicted. People spoke about this last year and 2 years ago. People have said this is likely to happen if these issues aren't fixed. And unless there's genuine reform, we will likely see more of these issues. I think I'll end on that. And thanks. Thank you.
I agree to. Is this working?
It's on.
I'm loud anyway, so that should. What?
If you push it, yeah.
Okay. I agreed to go last because I'm sort of pulling some of this together and looking at the current issues, which has meant I'm sort of re-scrambling my notes in my head for the last 10 or 15 minutes. You had a very good presentation, or two presentations, about the underpinnings of Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism and the rise of the Sinhalese Buddhist state. And what I would like to do is sort of move us to the last several years and look at the issues that are still facing basically all minorities in Sri Lanka. And there's a number of comments I want to make. For years, I got into trouble from the first time when I went to Sri Lanka before the war. It was very apparent something was going to happen. And the Sinhalese were all smiling, the Tamils knew there were problems. And I started saying something I've said for close to 40 years, that the greatest supporters of an independent Tamil Eelam are the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist extremists. Because they have constantly refused to allow the opportunity for minorities to be a part of Sri Lankan society. And added to them are the more moderate Buddhists who have denied that there is a problem. And I think after 2009, it became very clear Sri Lanka did not move towards reconciliation. The nationalists more or less saw this as the new awakening of Sinhalese nationalism, and the more moderate Sinhalese Buddhists in many ways sort of closed their eyes and ignored the underpinnings of what is going on in the country. Last week, the U.S. State Department issued its 2018 Human Rights Report, which is I think, pretty critical. I don't want to get into a critique of it. I have some complaints about it, but it's one of the more critical reports that the State Department has made. However, it does have some gaps in it that I want to try to cover and sort of in some ways spell out what the current issues facing religious minorities in Sri Lanka are. I think probably the biggest gap in the report is the section on religious freedom. It refers to the 2016 State Department report on religious freedom, which is a little bit dated at this point. Although actually I think the conclusions from that report are still accurate. We still have had a lot of things going on and the environment has changed a little bit. But the one thing that the report doesn't go into enough detail with, I mean, it does criticize the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which I don't think anyone has mentioned yet. It is now approaching 40 years that it's been in effect, either temporarily and then made permanent in the 80s. It allows the detention of anyone, and some Sinhalese do get detained, but allows the detention of anyone for mere suspicion and the ability of the security forces detaining the people from preventing those people going before a court. Now, the Sri Lankan Supreme Court has on numerous occasions restricted the ability of the security forces to basically hold people for a certain length of time. Basically, they have to bring them before a court. However, there are still reports of people suddenly being let out of prison after 20 years, having been held without any opportunity to go before any trial or magistrate. So they've largely ignored the court decisions. But the PTA has been used to cover up or protect the torture of individuals, both the torture, detention, and murder in some cases. It is still in effect, even though the war is now over for 9 years. In addition, there has been an environment of impunity in which the people who have perpetrated these human rights violations are allowed to basically go free. On the rare instances when the actual people that perpetrate the acts are arrested, usually the Sri Lankan court system has a problem in bringing justice rapidly or quickly. I shouldn't even use the word rapid when talking about it. It is a very slow process, but typically very few people ever get convicted. So what you have is this sense of impunity that anyone can take part, as the references that Mario made to the STF officers involved in the riots in Taldenia a month ago. Basically, they know they're not going to be punished. You have the detention and arrest, because a lot of those detentions and arrest and torture were basically ordered by people above them. So the result is that they know they can get away with that. You have, in the last 2 or 3 years, widespread findings that torture still exists in Sri Lanka. Human Rights Watch, in the most latest report, criticized the lack of accountability for those being involved in it. I thought, damning report of the Special Rapporteur for the United Nations basically met with detainees who were arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act the year before and had been tortured. These are the detainees that were actually released, and we don't even know about the ones that weren't released. The Associated Press a year ago interviewed 50 former detainees in London who had been raped and tortured. So you have this continuing problem of torture by the Sri Lankan security forces, and this dates back many, many years. The religious attacks, we tend to focus on the events in Kandy and Taldenia or the 2014 Barawala riots, but the simple reality is this is a day-to-day issue in a way of life that most religious minorities in Sri Lanka have to deal with, the constant harassment and abuse. And it doesn't usually rise to the level of riots and murder, but it's a constant harassment. Amnesty International reported a rise in attacks against Muslims in 2017. Open Doors USA ranks Sri Lanka 44th out of 50 persecutors of Christians, or countries persecuting Christians. The National Christian Evangelical Alliance of Sri Lanka reported 90 attacks against Christians or Christian churches in 2017. This is a serious issue, and it's not largely addressed. And there is impunity. Everybody's talked about Yannis Tero. Despite the fact that the BBS, the organization he leads, has been implicated in lots of acts, he has never been arrested. He has never been taken in, even charged. And the fact that he could meet with the president in Japan, I was laughing when you brought up the meeting with the Minister of Agriculture. Not only did he meet with the Minister of Agriculture, but the Minister of Agriculture published photos and sent out photos of him meeting with him. If you read some of the things that he has stated, it's scary, and it shows the kind of intolerance that I think even goes beyond the level of Sinhalese nationalism that we've become used to. Another area that's been ignored are the land issues in Sri Lanka. It is a nation of extreme population density. And what you have had is the seizure of large amounts of Tamil land and Muslim land and encroachment into grazing areas, especially in the eastern provinces. You have had, in the last 2 or 3 years, a number of instances where in the areas where the military has is always where they put up military bases. You always get Sinhalese merchants and traders who come and sort of surround the base, and this was during the war and since then as well. What you find also now are the construction of Buddhist temples and shrines on government land as well as on seized Tamil land, land that has never been, basically is owned by Tamils who had it taken away during the conflict. There's a whole set of issues that relate around the ability or the ownership of land, and especially in the great dry zone areas that have been a buffer between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. The Mahaveli Development Project settled large numbers of Sinhalese into the areas of that buffer zone and extended even beyond to the district, for instance. And there's a couple movements now about it into Mullativo district, which was a nearly 100% Tamil Hindu district before the creation of the Mahaveli, I believe, the H project. I complained a number of years ago at the Mahaveli Authority because their maps showed the project in neighboring Trincomalee district and in Anuradhapura. And they actually changed the maps, and they ended up putting it and showing that they were settlers in the Tamil lands. Initially during the war, they were prisoners who were offered freedom and a gun if they would settle in areas that were considered under the control of the LTTE. Many of them left, obviously. But you have an issue where there's increased conflict between the Tamils and the Muslims and the Sinhalese that live in those areas. Typically, the security forces, whether the police or the army, side with the Sinhalese settlers and protect the Sinhalese settlers when there is a conflict. The final point I want to bring up, and I think it follows from both of Mario's and Michael's presentations, is the political inability of the government of Sri Lanka to change this situation. As Mario pointed out, the Sri Lankan political system is centered around actually close to three party systems. The dominant one that Mario talked about is the Sinhalese system, with the UNP and the SLFP have always traditionally been the party of the Sinhalese. They have made very few inroads among Tamils in the Tamil populated areas of the north and east. Because of this, basically the governments of Sri Lanka, whether they were UNP or SLFP, have always looked to the Sinhalese for their base of support, and that means they have to attend to the issues that Michael brought up, in the fact that many Sinhalese see Sri Lanka as that great guardian and bastion of the Sinhalese Buddhist society. When Maithripala Sirisena led his renegade group from the SLFP to unite with the United National Party and defeat the Rajapaksa government in 2015, he basically divided his own party, and as a result is now faced with the difficulty that he can never win an election in Sri Lanka or defeat the UNP. He's caught in a very awkward situation where he has to win back the Sinhalese nationalists, the more moderate ones that might support more moderate policies and more temperate policies towards the minorities in Sri Lanka. The recent local elections have shown the rise or the return of Rajapaksa, which to me is a very frightening prospect. He won 225, or came in first in 225 of the 338 contested municipal and Pradesha Sabhas. What this has done is it raises the threat that Mahinda may be able even to defeat the United National Party in a national election. And of course, his new party immediately called for national elections. That's probably not going to happen. There will be provincial council elections later this year, and obviously we will see whether there is any prospect of the Sirisena government continuing after those elections. The point I'm trying to make is that it's very difficult for a Sinhalese political party to reach out to the Muslims and the Tamils. I mean, they do it, they may be sincere about it, but politically the numbers work against them. So what you have in Sri Lanka is the continuation of human rights violations. They've changed over since Jerryson became president. I think there has been slight improvement, but also a disintegration in other areas, especially, excuse me, with the BBS attacking more Muslims now and focusing in that direction. The reconciliation plan is very, very weak. It's hard to call it a reconciliation plan. And the government either lacks the ability or the will to stop the impunity of the human rights violators or to stop the BBS, which is, I think, in most any other country would be considered a terrorist organization. And I'll stop with this, and we can open this up for questions.
I'll moderate the, let's see, would that work? Does that work?
Yep.
It's on, okay. I'll moderate the questions. Let me start off. I know I heard the last two presentations, and I apologize that I had to go all the way through a hearing and I didn't get yours. But admittedly, the justice reforms, the reconciliation plan that came out initially has moved very, very slowly. Some would say practically not at all on most of the major tenets. What do you think the United States should be doing, and what should we here in Congress be doing to try and urge movement by the Jerryson government? And all three of you can speak.
I'm dreading my
Let's just start here closest to me.
Yeah. All right, sure. I'll try to keep mine brief, but I know we have different points of view on this. I think it's important to think long term in trying to support certain measures and to recognize what I think Rob was pointing out, which is that the Jerryson government has not been an instigator of recent violence and is in a difficult position. I think we need to be supporting civil society and helping agencies with existing relationships, whether it's the USIP or the Colombian Embassy, and be sensitive in the process of the U.S. branding on money and initiatives. But I'll keep it right there and move on to more of the policy improvements.
Sir, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the U.S. has been a little bit too patient in allowing the Sri Lankans to keep putting off. I think there needs to be more pressure to push them towards the reconciliation, but not so far that you will, or we will completely basically defeat or undercut the political ability. I would agree very much with Michael about the strengthening of civil society groups, especially those that can try to promote a different vision of a multi-ethnic society in Sri Lanka.
Sure.
And that's what's missing.
Yeah, I certainly agree too. That in itself, though, is a path not completely void of traps. But because one of the biggest concerns that we have, and I know some of these folks have heard me talk about it before, a considerable part, a majority of the world's commerce flows within about 12 miles of the southern tip of Sri Lanka, and China is making big, bold moves to throughout the region, but particularly in Sri Lanka, to set up shop. And the last thing that America wants to do, obviously, is to tilt the scale and encourage the government in Sri Lanka to move more in close alignment with China. But I know. I agree with what both of you have said, but it's a path that is complex.
I think it's important to note that even Rajapaksa, after 2009, he quoted the West. He was quoting the US. It was the international community's disengagement with that that led him to go towards China. Even if you look at India, the port, the infamous port that China has now built in Hambantota, it was initially offered to India, but India knows a bad port when it sees one, and said, this is not a place to build a port. I mean, I think for China, they want to dump their money in places, so that's what they do. But I think in where the US can be effective is if you look at the things where there has been progress on, that was due to international pressure. I think sometimes the fear that if there's too much US pressure, it will be seen as an imperialist force or something is overblown, because the US has ramped up engagement, military engagement. Yesterday, a military ship arrived in Colombo, and people don't have that much of an issue with that, right? As in, it's not that the U.S. military engagement, the training that the U.S. military has done in places in the Tamil areas in the northeast and stuff. It's a Tamils that are opposed to that sort of thing. It's not the Sinhalese. But when it comes to the human rights framework and when it comes to progress and accountability, it's only then that they are opposed to U.S. Interference, so to say, right? And this comes down to the question as in who's Sri Lankan? Are the 1/3 of the country or 1/5 of the country who want to see more pressure on it on human rights and accountability and those things, are they not worthy to be listened to? So I think it comes to where what we need, and the reason why I spoke so much about the background is because in order to resolve the conflict, these issues need to be addressed. So accountability needs to be addressed. It's a core tenet of before you get to, it's impossible to reach reconciliation. And Sri Lanka is not going to get there on its own. It has proven that over the last, I think, especially over the last 3 years, it has shown that it's actually regressing. It's not, we're not even on the right trajectory towards change anymore. We've just completely gone off track now. So I think this is where international pressure is important. And without international pressure, we would not have had the 2015 resolution. And this is where the US, I think, played a key part. And levers exist. The engagement that the US has, it's over the last 2 years, 3 years, it has been very positive. Yeah, progress, substantive progress has been hailed, right? As in, and it's not even the Sinhalese human rights activists in Colombo say that, right? So I think there's been too much premature praise for progress that hasn't really happened, and that's actually undermined progress that should have happened.
Okay, ma'am, I saw your hand.
Yes, actually,
Tell us who
I
you
like
are
to.
and where you're from.
Okay, I'm Angelica Silva, and I'm a U.S. citizen who's lived in this country for 34 years. I am qualified to speak because I am born and raised a Buddhist, educated in Catholic schools. I taught in a Muslim school to encourage Muslim women to go into higher studies without early marriage. And being a Buddhist, I sing in the Catholic and Christian churches, including the Basilica, not far from here. And I made some notes during your discussions, and I have just returned from Sri Lanka, and I have a lot of contact with Sri Lanka at all levels. And I think there's a lot of mudslinging, I would use the word mudslinging, at the Sinhalese people. Although I am Sinhalese, I am very objective about what is right and wrong in our country. Some of you have not lived in Sri Lanka and don't have a proper feel for what's going on there. I would like to first address something that Mario said, where he said that Tamils have been marginalized, and since independence that they have not got, excuse me Mario, you know the British divide and rule. And when the British went to Sri Lanka in 1918, they kept the majority as underdogs because they would be less of a problem to the British. So what they did was they developed the minorities by, especially the Tamil-speaking people, by giving them missionary schools, education, high jobs in the government, and kept down the majority, right? And then when post-independence, when they were negotiating this claim for land, the 70% of the population in Sri Lanka is Sinhalese, and at the time of independence, the Tamil-speaking people were 15%, but now it's down to 12%, and if you want the answer to that, I know that too. But when it was 15%, the team that fought for independence included all ethnicities. There was a Gigi Ponnambalam, a lawyer by profession, who negotiated, and he wanted 50% of the country for 15% of the people. Now, the Prime Minister at that time was the late D.S. Senanayake, who was the first Prime Minister since British gave independence. Now, he was put in a difficult position, but it was Lord Mountbatten who stepped in and said, no, you can't have 50% of the land for 15% of the people. So then post-independence, the Sinhalese majority started to get educated, and then there was opportunities for them in government and other sectors. The dilution of their sole access to prosperity has been described as discrimination, because when the majority started to get educated and they went in to take positions, if there were 5 jobs and 4 went to the Tamil speaking people and 1 didn't, then it was construed as discrimination. And when it comes to marginalizing and discriminating, I would like to tell you that we have discrimination of all kinds in Sri Lanka. I myself have been a victim of discrimination just because I am a Sinhala Buddhist from the majority does not protect me from being discriminated. I have been discriminated in examinations. I have got jobs from Tamil bosses who loved me, and Tamil others have come and told me that I didn't have a right to that job. So we have all experienced discrimination. So I don't think
Do you have a question, ma'am?
No, my question is I want to respond to. And when it comes to marginalizing, Sri Lanka's education system provides university education.
There are others that are going to have questions
yes, but
too,
let
so
me just
make your
give these
point.
statistics. 12% of the Tamil population had 24% of the free seats in engineering schools, 22% of the free seats in medical schools. How can you say that they were marginalized? How can you say that?
Okay, I'm going to try to respond to part of this because I have been to Sri Lanka. I know Danny Davis has been there. And so I have seen firsthand as well. Now, I don't live there, and I'll be the first one to acknowledge that. And I certainly acknowledge that there is a very complex cultural and societal history leading up to the conflict in the first place. So I acknowledge that. What we have to go on at this point, we can't undo history. We can't change history. All we can do is try and address the quality of life and the religious and economic freedoms of all Sri Lankans under the current post-Civil War environment. And the basis of that has been a reconciliation plan that the Rajapaksa government agreed to, signed up to, and did not deliver on. And a Sirisena government who signed up to, ran on, and little progress has been made on. So all we have right now is a failure, in my view, of the government, both the Rajapaksa government and the Sirisena government, to stand up to the commitments to all people. See, we're not, I certainly don't believe that this caucus is advocating that the Sinhalese people or the majority be singled out and persecuted because of where they came from. What we're saying is that all people need to have those rights. So war crimes, displaced people, those who have had their lands, and I've been to the military locations and I've seen the military encampments that exist on private lands. I've seen the women, mostly women, who lost their husbands and their sons in the conflict, in the war, that are down on their knees removing bombs and landmines from their land so that they can reclaim what has been rightfully theirs. And it's not the government that's doing that. It's nonprofit and non-governmental organizations that are coming in and having to fill that void. So from my perspective, as an outside observer who comes from a country, and I appreciate your background, we live in a country here in America where we believe in the Bill of Rights. We believe in that idea that all men are created equal and that our rights come from a creator, not from government. But there are people in Sri Lanka in government that believe that people's rights or the lack of rights are dictated by government. And that's what their actions are showing, because they're not following through with the very reconciliation plans that they signed up to. Do any of you want to make a comment? Or did I say it?
Yeah.
I said it clearly? Okay. Sir, I'm going to go to you next.
Samuel Gowan, I have a simple question. What the U.S. can do? Can the U.S. quote unquote request the Buddhist government to engage with the Sinhalese Buddhist monks?
I think this is where you get the conflict of ruling of authority. You know, when you have Buddhist monks saying something and you have a politician trying to critique a Buddhist monk, they're not on equal playing field. I don't know if that would be an effective means. I do think what I was talking about is the way in which government will lend authority or power to these Buddhist monks. That needs to put a halt to. And right now, I mean, the Wesleyan has been looking at education as their primary concern, trying to educate new monks to think this way. So they're looking in the right direction of how to do influence. So if we want to look at this influence, go to education. Go to the people who have not yet become fully ordained or planning to, and begin to educate them. But I don't think you can critique a Buddhist monk in that way.
Can I make a comment about what you were saying?
Hold on a second. Hold on a second. We got people raising their hands. I saw this lady right back here.
Hi, I'm Tiffany from Congressman Donovan's office. What single legislative action do you think Congress could take to help the situation?
What single legislative act can Congress do? If there's one act, what would you recommend?
I think Congressman Johnson's comments before about the delicateness of this and the fact that Sri Lanka has opened the door to China, and the fact China would like to have a larger foothold and presence in Sri Lanka makes it very difficult.
Yeah,
there
is a, and I'm sorry, I'm coming to you. There is a delicate balance here. I've spent a lot of time talking with the U.S. ambassador to Sri Lanka, who deals with these issues on a daily basis, goes into the government offices, talks to the different government officials, and the Tamil and the Sinhalese leaders, cultural and civic leaders, and he's got a very good finger on the pulse. It's a very, very tenuous scenario. The Jerryson government, who made all the promises in getting elected to bring about the reconciliation reforms, they have not been able to deliver because of the influence of the Rajapaksa officials that are still part of the government. So you've got this intergovernment squabble that's going on. Nobody knows whether Jerryson can become reelected, or even whether Rajapaksa can be reelected, but someone from his party might be able to. We don't know that. And so there is a lot of intergovernment turmoil right now, trying to figure out who's the king of the hill, who's ultimately going to be that transformational leader, the George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan for the nation of Sri Lanka, to pull all of this together and to, like what this lady said, make sure that all the people, both the Sinhalese and the Tamils and everybody, has an opportunity to have their voices heard. Sir.
Sorry, can I just add something to today's question? So they are U.S. citizens who are or were part of the Sri Lankan military who are accused of having committed serious war crimes and atrocities. So that's something where the U.S. can actually act against its own citizens. And I know the US has denied visas to people in the military who are suspected of committing war crimes. But I think particularly in the case of Mr. Rajapaksa's brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is a US citizen and said to be frequently traveling in and out of the country, I think universal jurisdiction action against someone like that is clearly, has involvement in war crimes, would be something the US could do.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Suraj Naratna. I'm a senior Buddhist. Lived half of my life in Sri Lanka, almost 20 years here in the US.
Where do you work in?
I work here in DC.
Where do you
I work
work
as a financial controller.
Where?
As a financial controller
Oh.
in a company, in a healthcare company. Well, I wish we had more than 1 hour here because there's so much I want to say, but I want to just focus on some of the things that said by the panelists over here that are factually not correct. Because to me, it seems like you're just throwing so many things, and people here, there are so many here who don't know too much about Sri Lanka, and they're going to form opinions based on some of the things they're saying. So I just want to point out a few here. I mean, there's a whole lot. I wrote a lot of things here. Couple of things, Dr. Jerryson, right? He said that the JVP violence was against the Tamils. That is not true. JVP was fighting for a socialist, to form a socialist government in Sri Lanka.
And where do you, now, cite your references and where
Well,
do
I
you
mean,
get
this is
your
a fact.
information from?
I don't know, anybody denying that?
No.
Okay.
Because
So,
we lived there during that time.
so I mean, you could look this up, right? So they were fighting.
No, I don't have time to look it up. If
Okay.
you're gonna make claims, these people go there, they visit there. When was the
Right,
last
sure,
time you
sure.
were there?
I will
When
forward
was
your
the last
office.
time you were there?
This Sri Lanka?
Yeah.
I go every year to Sri Lanka, but the JVP violence happened when I was in Sri Lanka as a
Yes.
schoolboy.
Okay.
But can I just finish this, then you can
And I'm
answer?
not
Right.
denying what you're saying, I'm
Right,
just
right.
asking you to
No,
cite
but-
your reference,
sure,
how
sure,
you know
sure.
your
Yeah,
information.
this is exactly what I'm saying. A lot of people here don't know exactly what's going on in Sri Lanka, because you know a little bit and you throw that out and then people form opinions, right? So that's one thing I want to, JVP's violence was mostly directed towards Sri Lankan army and eventually the Sinhalese people, because they were fighting against the Indian army at that time who was in Sri Lanka. So eventually, almost 80,000 Sinhala youths were killed by the Sri Lankan government. But of course, there was no panels, no human rights by US, nothing, right? So that was factually wrong. The second thing is he talked about a halal ban in Sri Lanka, right? So the halal ban was not a halal ban. I don't know whether you know what halal ban is. The halal ban was, there was a movement by the chicken producer in Sri Lanka, who's a majority Muslim. It's a Muslim-run business in Sri Lanka. They were trying to make all pork production halal. There was the Sinhalese were against that, because they were going to try to make the entire poultry production halal. So they said, no, you can't do that. It wasn't a halal ban. Even today, if you go to Sri Lanka, you go to a grocery store, you can buy halal chicken, you can buy the regular poultry. It's just like here, right? The other thing, he said the recent violence in Kandy was as a result of a Sinhala, you said Sinhala attacking a Muslim driver. Unfortunately, it's the other way around. It's completely other way around, right? So, if you said that, then that was okay. I thought that's what you said.
And the other, I think you misunderstood him.
Yeah, okay, so that's fine. That's fine. But anyways, my point is, I tell everyone who's interested in Sri Lanka, and I'm sure you've studied a lot, just don't throw things at, and people are going to make opinions. And by doing that, I don't think you're going to help reconciliation in this matter. If you want true reconciliation, this kind of attack, I think some of you have a political agenda. So I think that if you go through from that angle, you will never solve this problem.
Okay, but we're way off of our topic, because the concern that this caucus has is that the Sri Lankan government has not followed through. Now, we can debate all day long what we know and what we don't know, and the history. What we do know is the reconciliation plan that the government of Sri Lanka signed up to identify lost persons, to return lands that were occupied by the military, to identify war crimes and hold those accountable. That has not happened.
Well, that happens is gradual.
No,
And
no, it's not
No,
happening.
it happens. Recently, 630 acres were released. I don't know that you knew that. It happens gradually. I mean, what they expect is the Sri Lankan army to completely withdraw, and that's not going to happen. I mean, it's like you know, somebody coming and telling the U.S. military to vacate Hawaii. That's not going to happen, right? It's going to be gradual. Sure, Sri Lankan army is in private land in the northern east, but you have to remember the civil war just ended less than 10 years ago. So it's going to take time. So I think
It's gonna take time. We can
So
debate that
this
too. You
is-
know, America went through a civil war too.
Right.
In 1865, our Civil War ended. It didn't take time. We had a leader who said, we're gonna come together as one nation. There was no punishing of those that started the war
There you
and
go. But
those
that's
that
not what they're asking.
participated in the
That's not
war.
what they're asking. They're asking for punishment.
Whoa,
what do you mean,
There you go, right there.
And I don't totally disagree with you.
Yeah.
That part of this reconciliation process is putting the wounds aside and moving
Sure,
forward.
and it's very unfortunate because if you go to Colombo, you'll see
Yeah.
40% of the population in Colombo is Tamil. People live, I mean, here we are Christians here. People live a normal life in Sri Lanka. It's just, I think it's very political. I mean, you'll find out most of this is very political. It also involves geopolitics, unfortunately, because
All
of the Chinese
politics are
factor.
local. even in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, but
Okay, I know we had some comments here. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I think one important thing we should be making here is the issue of authority in terms of qualifying authority. So being from Ohio does not make me an expert in Ohio. It doesn't. Being raised in a Christian household does not make me an expert on Christianity. So getting to the JVP accusation you made. Look to Santh and Vice was betrayed. He's from Sri Lanka. Look at Ishmael Asanavarat, his work with kings. Look to Ananda Abhisekara's color of robes. All these critically address the JVP and the inclusion of Buddhist monks and Buddhists along with socialist views in their violence early on in the 1980s. The halal ban, I did not say took place, it's a rhetoric I said that's been used to trigger violence. So I'm not saying that the ban took place, but it's been a rhetoric that has been invoked by many monks. Excuse me, hold on. So if you want to invoke sources, sir, you may. But Prasanna Hanapal has written quite a bit on this. She is Sri Lankan. She's employed at universities in Sri Lanka. She's written quite a bit on this as well, too. And there's been many people on record, along with Janasara Pero, who's spoken on this. So instead of talking about our feelings and our opinions, it's important for us to voice and cite facts from evidence and sources. And I know this is all very difficult because we're talking about religion and culture here. It makes all of us very, I know, contentious. But in terms of political agendas, I don't have one. I'm a professor at Youngstown State University. I have been attacked by Buddhists and by Muslims in my fieldwork. I have no particular partisan play in this discussion.
I'm the only one that has a political. I tell you what, I know we've got other questions, but we have exhausted our caucus time today. Look, I would love to stay all afternoon and continue this discussion. Here's what I think has happened. This is the most lively and I think important discussion that we've had in this caucus, probably in the past 2 to 3 years. I think this is important dialogue that needs to take place to get to the root of the issues. And so I want to thank everybody for coming today, particularly our panelists. These issues are complex. There is no question about that. What's right in one person's mind is not right in another person's mind. And we in the United States have to understand that Sri Lanka is a sovereign nation. We can certainly not impose our will or our ideal of what is right or wrong on another sovereign nation. But we can certainly stand up for the cause of justice and freedom and human rights for people all around the world. And with that, I really do hate to cut off the discussion, but I have to go.
Can I just make one little statement,
Well,
please?
you can, but we're gonna have to.
Very short. I believe in true reconciliation and rehabilitation, which the government has rehabilitated all the child soldiers. And the only thing is everybody has to be sincere on all sides. And if we keep on drumming the human rights abusers by one side and ignore that terrorism.
And it doesn't.
No.
The reconciliation plan and the statements that I have made in here has acknowledged that there were violations on both sides.
Yes, the violations on both sides.
Yes.
And the country is still suffering from the people maimed and blinded and killed, and families that have suffered with suicide bombings and all that. And if you're going to punish one side, but because they are non-state players, you cannot fight them. But there were people who financed it from the US as well, who violated the Patriots Act. So if you have submitted any help to terrorism, then those people have to be dealt with too.
Like I said, these issues are very, very complex, and I will be the first to acknowledge that. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. And,